DND number 2, Suffer the Children in Jesus' Name. Chapter 1 and front matter of the book. This book is dedicated to all the now grown-up little Carolines out there. You can heal. Being a victim no longer serves you. To Jim, Libby, JP, and Carrie Still, I will always love you. And here's a special dedication. Like the Stillwaters in the story, there have been strong people in my life who were there for me without ever knowing how much their presence meant. They weren't trying to make a statement or get glory. They were simply doing the right thing. And this is dedicated to all those people who simply do the right thing, even when it's hard. You are the true heroes. Matthew 19:13 through 14. Then were there brought unto him little children, that he should put his hands on them and pray. And the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus said, Suffer little children, and forbid them not to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven. Note to readers. The story you're about to read covers many topics and issues, including child abuse, rape, alcoholism, mental illness, and even touches on incest. The intention is not to dwell on these negative things, but to help those who've been touched by these things by pulling them out of hiding, shining a light to expose them, and hopefully bring the injured parties closer to God and to heal in Jesus' mighty name. My intention is also to remind everyone that real love does exist. It is beautiful and it is possible. When his disciples heard it, they were exceedingly amazed, saying, Who then can be saved? But Jesus beheld them and said unto them, With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Matthew 19:25 through 26. Quote, The course of true love never did run smooth. End quote, William Shakespeare. Chapter 1. Caroline, get down here and find my glasses. Virginia Jones stumbled around the kitchen, knocking over dishes and mumbling obscenities, the pungent odor of alcohol and sweat wafting around her as she moved. Caroline, get your skinny butt down here now. Suppressing a shudder, little Caroline Jones closed the book she'd been assigned to read over the Christmas holidays by her 7th grade teacher. Setting the book carefully aside, she rose, reluctantly leaving the relative safety of her little room. Using a practiced stealth, she moved down the stairs of the small townhouse and peeked around the corner to peer at her mother. Disheveled and filthy in her oversized orange and yellow floral house dress, her mother shoved dirty cups and plates across the kitchen counter, apparently in an effort to find the missing eyeglasses. When Caroline crept into the room, her mother looked up sharply. Well, what are you staring at? Find my glasses! Caroline swallowed hard. Mama, she whispered, your glasses are on your head. When her mother looked at her as if she'd grown horns, she realized she would have to retrieve the glasses herself. Approaching cautiously, she reached a shaky hand up and plucked the glasses off her mother's head and held them out to her. Virginia snatched them away, but before Caroline could move safely out of reach, her mother grabbed her cheeks in one iron hand. Are you being smart? No, ma'am. Balling her hands into fists to keep them from trembling, she tried to hide her fear. Her mother held her there several moments as if she were trying to decide whether Caroline's actions warranted some sort of punishment. When she finally released her, Caroline quietly sighed with relief. As she watched her mother weave her way toward the front room, she wondered if she could sneak back up the stairs. It had been a horrible week. Her mother had been worse than ever, drinking herself into a stupor every night. Usually, Caroline was able to help her up to bed before she passed out, but 2 days ago, on Christmas Day, she didn't make it. Halfway up the steps, her mother simply dropped. They both ended up at the bottom of the steps. Caroline had tried to drag her over to the couch, but her mother was too heavy for Caroline's 95-pound body. She ended up covering her with a quilt and tucking a pillow under her head. The next morning, there had been hell to pay, though Caroline was used to it. Since her father had left them several years earlier, the 2 weeks of Christmas vacation had been torture. There was less than a week to go before school started again, and unlike the other kids, Caroline looked forward to going back to school and the reprieve it would offer. However, this next week wasn't going to be all bad, for Caroline was about to go on an adventure. Tomorrow, she would get to leave the dingy little townhouse apartment for 4 glorious days. The couple for whom she regularly babysat was taking her with them on a trip to Tennessee. She was to help take care of their children over the New Year's weekend. Caroline's mom had resisted the idea until Caroline reminded her it would mean extra money. The family, Jim and Sylvia Stillwater, shared the same townhouse apartment building along with Caroline and her mom and a few other families. Their front doors all opened onto a tiny common front yard. The day the Stillwaters had moved in, Caroline had watched first from her bedroom window and later from the small porch. When the Stillwaters' 2-year-old had started for the street, Caroline had dashed after her and scooped her up. The Stillwaters were grateful, and the children took to Caroline immediately. It wasn't long after that she found herself employed to be their everyday babysitter. Caroline thought the Stillwaters were the best people she'd ever known, and their 2 children, Paul and little sister Lynn, seemed more like Caroline's own brother and sister. Paul was now 4, and Lynn was 3. And though Caroline herself was only 12, the Stillwaters trusted her, and that meant the world to Caroline. She wasn't alone with the children for very long each day. Mr. Stillwater worked during the day and was home by 5. Mrs. Stillwater had to leave for her job just after 3 in the afternoon, so Caroline was in charge of the children for less than 2 hours each day. The moment she arrived home from school, she would dump her books and head over to the Stillwaters. She loved watching Mrs. Stillwater get ready for work, putting on her makeup and ironing her skirt and curling her hair. She was beautiful, Caroline thought, and when she left each day, she would kiss her children so sweetly. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Caroline remembered her own mother doing that when she'd been little. That, however, had been before her father had left them. Her memory of him grew a little dimmer every day. Had there even been a man who laughed with her and tossed her into the air and promising never to let her fall when she'd screamed in both fear and delight? No more dark memories now, Caroline thought, drawing a deep breath. Tomorrow, she and the Stillwaters would be driving from Atlanta to the Tennessee mountains, and no matter what she ended up doing, she was sure it'd be better than what lay in store for her here at home. Caroline! Rousing herself from her reverie, she hurried into the living room. Yes, Mama? Where are my car keys? The question put dread in Caroline's heart, for even if it meant another beating, there was no way she could let her mother drive in her current condition. She might kill herself, or even worse, someone else. And even though there had been times Caroline had wished her mother dead, she didn't really mean it. Well, are you going to just stand there like some idiot? Where are they? I don't know, Mama, she lied. Her mother moved toward her. I want them, and I want them now, she screeched. Before Caroline had a chance to answer, the woman swung, knocking Caroline to the floor. She rose shakily, licking at a small drop of blood on her lip. Slowly she raised her eyes to meet her mother's, bracing for the next blow. But she could see in her mother's eyes it would be a different path this time. Oh, baby, I'm so sorry, her mother cried with tears in her eyes. She reached for Caroline, grabbing her by the shoulders and pulling her hard up against her. I'm so sorry. I'm just so tired, you know? I just need to run to the store to get me something to help me sleep. You understand, don't you? Mama didn't mean to knock you down, baby, but you know you need to help me when I ask you to. It's just me and you, baby girl. Just me and you. We got to stand together. It's okay, Mama, Caroline comforted, pulling away. I know you didn't mean it. Come on, I'll help you find the keys. She took her mother by the hand and led her to sit on the sofa. Let me see now. Maybe they're under here. Caroline lifted the cushion of the overstuffed chair. She glanced at her mom, then turned to shuffle through some newspapers on a table, pretending to look for the car keys. It took only a few minutes for her mother to finally pass out. And in a reversal of roles, Caroline covered her with the old quilt she'd brought down 2 days earlier. rubbed a gentle hand against her mother's cheek. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered. She grabbed a sweater for herself and slipped outside. She needed fresh air. New scene. "Not much longer now, Caro," Mrs. Stillwater called back to her. Caroline smiled at the news and at her nickname. The children had decided that Caroline was too long and too hard to say, so Caro it had been from the first week she'd known them. Inversely, she'd told them that their names were too short, and from now on, Paul was Paulacalooza, and Lynn was Lanelli Belly, which had led to many giggles and tickling matches. Stiff from the long drive, Carol took a moment to stretch out her legs. She'd kept the children laughing and giggling for many miles, and finally, after a rest stop, the children had wound down and were nodding off in their car seats. Carol had been singing silly songs softly to her charges in the back seat of the minivan when Mrs. Stillwater pointed out their exit sign. Carol had no idea where they were except somewhere outside of Nashville in the Tennessee mountains. They would be visiting old college friends of the Stillwaters who lived on a farm in the middle of nowhere, as Mr. Stillwater put it. Carol would be in charge of keeping the children as occupied as possible while the parents partied in the front room on New Year's Eve. The children woke once the van left the interstate, so Carol occupied them by teaching them to count cows, and then telephone poles, and then gas stations, until they were all counted out. And they turned onto a dirt road and laughed as the bumpy road made their voice boxes vibrate while they sustained a note. Around the next bend, they came upon a clearing. Around the next bend, they came upon a clearing. Carol's mouth fell open. The view was awesome. They were on a mountainside, a patchwork of fenced-off fields in the distance. "Oh, my," Carol said softly. "It's like being at the top of the world." Mrs. Stillwater smiled at Carol. "Pretty, isn't it? In the spring, those fields are lush and green, and see that long line of trees? Those will be covered with tiny pink or white flowers. It's probably hard to imagine, but believe me, it's beautiful." Carol had no trouble imagining. It was already beautiful. Up on the mountainside, it really did seem like she was on top of the world, looking down on her kingdom. She turned her head to peer up toward the top of the hill. That must be the house, she thought, only it was nothing like Carol had pictured it. Mr. Stillwater had said it was a farmhouse, and Carol had thought of an old rustic building, the wood graying, maybe an old red barn beside it. This house was nothing like that. It was one of those modern houses she'd seen in magazines with lots of huge windows that made it look like it was made of glass. Carol peered through that glass, as they circled around the drive and pulled up to the front of the house. It looked warm and inviting. She could see lots of wood, wide wooden beams across the ceiling, and wood shelves lined with books. There was a pale blue sofa with lots of bright pillows, and she could see a fire in the fireplace calling for her to come and warm herself. The van came to a halt, and Carol immediately turned to help the children out of their car seats. Everyone piled out, and Carol followed the Stillwaters up the steps of an enormous wraparound porch. They didn't have to knock. The door swung open, and a beautiful lady with dark hair and bright blue eyes was laughing and hugging and pulling everyone in out of the cold December air. Mr. Stillwater heartily shook the hand of a large man with a giant smile. Paul and Lynn were being hugged and kissed and told how they'd just been babies when last seen. The beautiful lady finally turned to peer at Caroline. "And who is this pretty little thing?" Caroline quickly looked behind her, making everyone laugh. Realizing the lady had been speaking about her, she blushed. Jim Stillwater gently placed his hand on Carol's shoulder. "This is the amazing young lady I told you about. We simply could not get along without her. Carol, I'd like you to meet my good friends, Joe and Ellen Smith." "It's nice to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Smith," Caroline said softly. "Oh, please, call us Joe and Ellen," the woman answered. She won't do it," Sylvia Stillwater laughed. "She has Southern manners that won't quit. She's known us for over a year now and won't call us anything but Mr. and Mrs. Stillwater." Ellen smiled kindly. "Well, that's just fine then. Come in the kitchen now. I bet y'all are hungry." "Where are the kids?" Jim Stillwater asked Joe. Well, Molly and Ben are over at the neighbor's house trying out their new PlayStation. Tobias is out on the tractor doing chores, but should be in soon, seeing as how it's lunchtime, and that boy never misses a meal. Carol peered around wide-eyed as they were ushered inside. She'd never seen a home so lovely. In the kitchen, they were served thick meat sandwiches and bowls of steaming hot soup. Carol couldn't keep her eyes from taking in every detail. They sat at a huge, shiny wood table. The room was so big it seemed like a giant lived here. In the kitchen where she lived, there was barely room for two people to stand. Here, along with the large table, was a bar with stools, a computer desk with a chair, and still enough room left to ride a bike in circles around a cooking island that was right in the middle of the floor. Shiny, fancy-looking pots and pans hung over the cooking island, and off against one wall was a beautiful window seat. Carol could imagine snuggling up there to read or dream or just be alone. She sighed. It was the most wonderful room she'd ever been in. While the adults laughed and told stories, Carol made short work of her own lunch and then turned to encourage the children to eat. When she realized the grown-ups wanted to adjourn to the living room, Carol promised to stay with the children while they finished up. For once, the children were being quiet while they ate. So quiet that Carol was able to hear the conversation taking place in the other room. She wished she couldn't. Y'all must be tired. Excuse me. Y'all must be tired. Not too bad. We all had a nap. All? Jim questioned. Sylvia laughed. Well, all except Jim, who was driving. And Caro, Jim added. When the kids fell asleep, she pulled out her book and read. Caro, what a pretty little girl she is, Ellen said softly. That blonde hair and those big brown eyes, they just look heavenly together, but she's awfully thin, isn't she? She is thin, Sylvia agreed. I know things are tight for her and her mom. I keep my refrigerator full of food, but still she hardly ever helps herself. We guess that she's just not a big eater. Or maybe it's those southern manners you were talking about, Joe put in. Where's her father? James shrugged. Good question. Never seen him. Carol's not a big talker, and neither is her mother. From what I can gather, he left them several years ago, Sylvia said. He doesn't send child support? Joe asked. Sylvia shook her head. I don't think they even know where he is. Carol's mom works in an office in downtown Atlanta, and Caroline has had to be very self-sufficient. She's quite mature for her age, and she's a real sweetie. She seems to be, Ellen agreed. Her hair is such a pretty blonde, they could use it on the front of a box of hair color. I'd like to trim it up, though. When it gets that long, it starts to look stringy. Joe laughed. My Ellen, she's still trying to make people over. Saving the world from fashion mistakes, one person at a time, Ellen said with a giggle. In the kitchen, Carol finished up with the children and worked on clearing the lunch dishes, trying her best to ignore the whispers coming from the other room, since she was pretty sure she wasn't supposed to be hearing what was being said. She caught a glimpse of herself in the glass of the double oven and tugged on a lock of her hair, trying to see what Mrs. Smith saw. Hello. Drawing in a sharp breath, Carol swung around. The glass she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. A boy, the owner of the voice that had just startled her, reached out toward her, and she ducked instinctively, and he withdrew his hand. Everybody okay in there? Ellen called from the other room. Caroline could feel the blood drain from her face. She'd been there a little over an hour and had already messed up. The boy's eyes met hers, and to her surprise, he winked at her. Everything's fine, Mom, he answered, kneeling to pick up the pieces of glass. I just dropped a glass. No biggie. I'm picking it up. Well, be careful, please. Yes, ma'am. He looked up at the girl. Her mouth formed a perfect O. He smiled at her. What? It was my fault. She shook her head. Yeah, it was. If I hadn't scared you, you wouldn't have dropped it. He stood with the pieces and went to the trash can. You must be the one who's going to babysit tomorrow night. My name's Toby. What's yours? He turned and held out his hand, and Caro shook it timidly. Caro? Caro. Well, Caro, it's nice to meet you. She smiled. He's very nice, she thought, and very cute. Caro, I want to get down, Lynn demanded. Let me get a broom first, Toby said. While the boy swept up, Carol turned to take care of the little ones, wiping their hands and faces and helping them down and patting their bottoms as they ran to join their parents. Carol quickly cleaned up the rest of the lunch mess and stood in the threshold watching the children, while behind her, Toby fixed his own sandwich. He passed her, sandwich in hand, as he entered the living room to greet his parents and company. Carol watched him. He walked slowly, casually, as if he had all the time in the world to move from one place to another. "Hello there, Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Jim." His voice was deep like a man's, which was probably what had startled her, yet he wasn't a man. Mrs. Stillwater had said the Smith's oldest son was close to Carol's age. He looks like his mom, Carol thought, with the same black hair and blue eyes. But he's tall like his dad, and he's cute, she thought again. Mr. and Mrs. Stillwater rose and looked him over. Mr. Stillwater shook his hand and mussed his hair and talked about what a fine young man he'd grown into. And Mrs. Stillwater hugged him and kissed his cheek and said he was still just a little boy to her and always would be. "Honey," his mother began, "would you mind straightening up the lunch dishes for me so I can show our company around and get them settled?" It's already done." "Oh, thank you, sweetheart. I hadn't realized you'd been in the kitchen that long." "I haven't. She did it." He jerked a thumb back at Caro. She looked down immediately, her cheeks warming. "Well, thank you, Caro. I'm beginning to see why the Stillwaters think you're so indispensable." She nodded politely. New scene. Brow creased. Brow creased, Toby studied the girl from his bedroom window as he changed his shirt for dinner. She'd taken little Paul and Lynn out to play on the tire swing in the backyard. She was having to run beside Lynn to make sure she didn't fall. Carol's long blonde hair blew all around her in the cold wind, making it a tangled mess. The spots of red on her cheeks were evidence of just how cold it was. And even though he couldn't hear what they were saying, he could tell she was trying to talk the children into coming back inside, and they kept talking her into one more term. He frowned when he realized an ugly gray sweater that was minus a few buttons was her only protection against the icy wind. Ragamuffin. That's the word his mother would use to describe her. Not unkindly, though. She would mean it in a charitable way, like she wishes she could do something about it. He considered it. Yep, definitely a ragamuffin. His heart went out to her. He thought about how scared she looked earlier when she thought she would be in trouble for breaking a glass, and how she'd flinched when he'd reached toward her. He shook his head. Something wasn't quite right about her. And man, when she smiled at him in the kitchen, well, it was definitely weird. It was as if the sun had burst out from behind the clouds. His mother used to say that about his little sister Molly when she'd been just a baby. "Watch," his mom would say. "Her little smile just lights up the room." He was beginning to understand. "Well, I don't care what you say. I like her." The little sister he'd just been thinking about was yelling out in the hallway, probably at his younger brother, he mused. Toby made his way out to the hall where they argued. Hey, what's going on, guys?" "Ben says that girl is ugly, and I think he's being mean," 5-year-old Molly argued. "What girl?" Toby asked. "The girl that's visiting us," Ben answered. "You know, that Carol girl. What a dumb name." Toby winked at Molly. "You're absolutely right, Moll. Ben is being mean. Mom's not going to be too happy to learn that Ben is being rude to a guest, huh?" "Man," Ben protested, "I didn't say anything to the girl. I was only talking to Big Mouth here." "It's all the same, Ben." "Well, you don't want me to lie, do you? She's skinny, and her hair is ugly, and she doesn't even wear a coat when she goes outside. I mean, how dumb is that?" "Ben, sometimes there are things that—" His voice trailed off as the one they spoke of appeared on the stair landing. Her face seemed pale, and Toby thought he saw her chin quiver before she smiled nervously. I was just going to get cleaned up before dinner," she explained. They moved out of her way so she could enter the bathroom. "Now you've gone and done it, Ben," Toby said, his voice low. Molly's hands went to her hips, imitating her mother. "I bet she heard you. I'm telling Mom." The two ran downstairs, still arguing. Toby was also pretty sure Carol had heard the comments his 8-year-old brother had so callously made. So, why should he care so much? He liked girls and all, but she was only a little girl, and he was practically a man at 14. Still, somehow, for some reason, she got to him. His mom said she was 12, but she seemed older. Ancient, maybe. And no matter what Ben said, she was nowhere near ugly, especially when she smiled. She was thin, he conceded. Her brown eyes seemed too large for her narrow face, and her hair looked as if it hadn't been brushed in weeks, but still, she wasn't ugly. The kids at school would give him a real hard time if they knew he was even slightly interested. He wondered what it was about her that affected him so. Lips pursed, he thought about it. Her eyes. It was her eyes, he decided. They reminded him of a wounded animal. Much to his mother's dismay, he was always rescuing critters. He'd find an injured squirrel or an old homeless dog and would bring them home and nurse them back to health. He couldn't stand to see them suffer. And now this girl was making him feel like she was some wild creature that needed to be rescued. He shouldn't care, but he couldn't help it. Oh, what the heck, it didn't matter anyway, because in a few days she would be gone. Still, for now, he figured he could do something. He could apologize for what Ben had said. The bathroom door opened and she stepped out, and her head jerked up, obviously surprised to find him still there in the hall. Hello again, he said. I didn't mean to scare you. She smiled. Yep, Toby thought. Her face really did light up like someone turned on a switch. Actually, if you took just her face and separated it from the scraggly hair and the too thin body and put it on the front of one of those magazines that his mother liked to read, she could be like a model. It's okay, she said softly. You're pretty good at it. His brow drew together. He'd forgotten what he'd said, and he glanced up at her. She was giggling. A joke? Oh, yeah, about the way he keeps scaring her. Yeah, he grinned. I suppose I am. That's twice already. His mind stalled. Come on, stupid. Make polite conversation. How do you like Tennessee? She sighed deeply. It's so pretty here. Your home is really nice. Her voice was soft. Her Georgia accent was pronounced and somehow different from the Tennessee Southern drawl that he was used to hearing. He sat on the top step, patted the space next to him, and was a little surprised when she accepted the invitation and eased down to sit. Listen, he began. I know you heard what Ben said. It doesn't matter, she jumped in. Kids can be cruel. She looked away and shrugged. It doesn't really bother me. Well, we don't like for anyone in our family to be cruel, so I apologize for him, if you'll accept. She shrugged. Okay. They sat silently, side by side, hands resting on their knees, their chins on their hands. Reaching down, he wiped some dirt from the toe of her shoe. He raised his hand, looking around for somewhere to wipe the mud, and, grinning, started toward her. She laughed. Don't you dare. Smiling, he shrugged and wiped the mud on his jeans. It snowed last week, so it's still muddy outside, I guess. I hope I didn't track mud on the carpet, she said, the worry creeping into her voice. He grinned. Well, it sure wouldn't be the first time, with my little brother and sister and all their friends coming in and out. You got any brothers or sisters? No, it's just me. Carol stood. I better go. I'm supposed to be watching Paul and Lynn, and they get into stuff pretty fast. Wait, Toby said, grabbing her hand. She looked down at his hand holding hers and back up at him with a very grown-up look of impatience on her face. Toby wasn't sure why he tried to stop her from going, and he sure as heck didn't understand why he had hold of her hand and felt as if he couldn't let it go. She pulled away first, her hand trembling, and hurried away, leaving Toby to wonder what had just happened. Whatever it was, he just decided it was dangerous, and he would steer clear the rest of the night. New scene. The next morning found Carol in such a state of panic that she actually argued with Mrs. Stillwater, something she'd never ordinarily do. The women had decided on a trip to the mall to get new outfits, including Caroline. Her mind was frantic with what-ifs, like, what if they want to know what size she wears? How can she explain that she really isn't sure, since all her clothes came from local church charity? And then they'll make her the center of attention, something she despised. And oh no, what if someone wanted to step into a dressing room with her? they would see. But I just can't go shopping with you. I promised Paul and Lynn I would play horsey with them, Carol protested, saying the first thing that came to her mind, which she realized was absolutely feeble. It's okay, Mrs. Stillwater soothed. It's not often us girls get to have a day to ourselves. The men will be able to handle the kids just fine. Besides, Molly wants you to come. She doesn't have any sisters, and she really likes you. Come on, Carol, it's New Year's Eve. Everyone needs to be gorgeous for New Year's Eve. Why? All I'm going to do is babysit. And you're going to look beautiful while you're doing it, Mrs. Smith insisted as they dragged the reluctant young lady off to the mall. New scene. Ellen Smith was having Carol try on everything in the store, or so it seemed to Caroline. She tried to be polite as Mrs. Smith chattered away, working her way through racks of clothing. Of course, we must get the right kind of shoes to wear with those jeans and a jacket. She tapped her chin. I think that red sweater will also do nicely. Caroline had been able to avoid the disaster of having someone accompany her into the dressing room by claiming extreme modesty. However, in exchange for letting her dress in private, she had to come out of the dressing room to model each outfit. It seemed to Carol that the stack of potential winners was never ending. Finally, though, Mrs. Smith settled on a couple of outfits for Carol, and they talked her into wearing her new jeans and sweater while they continued the shopping trip. Carol had begun to breathe a sigh of relief when the women focused their attention on Molly. Unfortunately, that didn't last long. And just as Carol had begun to relax, she found herself in a hair salon. Suddenly, she was whisked off to have her hair washed, conditioned, and trimmed. The women oohed and awed over how shiny Carol's hair was and how bouncy now that a few inches had been cut. Caroline only shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. She hated being the center of attention. She hated even more that they were treating her as if she were a charity case. I know, Mrs. Smith said, her voice filled with excitement. Let's get your ears pierced. Surprisingly, it was Mrs. Stillwater who stepped in this time. Oh, I don't think Carol's mom would like that. When all eyes turned toward her, Carol shrugged nonchalantly. Mama won't care. Caroline didn't know why she'd said it. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was wishful thinking. Whatever the reason, it was false. Her mother would definitely care. She tried to backpedal and talk her way out of it, but she was no match for Mrs. Smith. She'd had to desperately blink back the tears when the steel post shot through her earlobes. And by the time they arrived back at the house, Caroline was decked out in new jeans, sweater, shoes, and a soft, warm, quilted jacket. She had other packages too, shampoos and cosmetics and underwear, and her hair shone, her ears sparkled, and she was mortified. Everyone in the house crowded around the kitchen table to see their purchases. Molly's new dress and Ellen's gorgeous leather handbag and Sylvia's strappy shoes. Time and again, Ellen pointed out Carol's new haircut and her new outfit, and by the third time someone said, just look at how pretty Carol looks in that red sweater, she thought she would shrivel up and die. At least she hoped she would. Carol was immensely relieved when she was finally allowed to go up to her room. But Ellen wasn't done yet. Toby, do me a favor, dear. Toby frowned. He didn't like the sound of that. What is it, Mom? Well, Carol seems to be such a shy child, don't you think? And I was just wondering, since you're so close to her age, would you just go up and talk to her, so she doesn't feel left out and alone while she's here? He rolled his eyes at his mother. She smiled. My heart just goes out to her. Your heart goes out to everyone, Mom. Well, you have no room to talk, young man, you and your animals. Please go talk to her, Toby. She seems upset. Maybe you could find out what's bothering her. He sighed. Okay, I'll talk to her. But don't ask me to take her to the party tonight. Amy's going to be there, and it'll ruin everything. His mother smiled at him. Oh, I wouldn't dream of ruining everything. Besides, Carol is our babysitter, so she can't go to the party. She touched his cheek. Thanks, baby. Now, go on up. I think I may have been a little too overbearing, so make her feel better. You? Overbearing? Not my mom, he said sarcastically. She smacked his rear. New scene. Toby knocked softly on Carol's door, and when she didn't answer, he opened it and peeked in. Caroline sat cross-legged on the bed, staring out the window. "Hey." Her head jerked around. She started to tell him to go away, but realized she had no right to say that to him. After all, it was his home. Still, she didn't have to talk to him, and she didn't want to, and she truly didn't want to. She didn't want to talk to anyone. Why couldn't everyone just leave her alone? He drew a deep breath and smiled at her as he came into the room, closing the door behind him. She watched warily as he sat down on the edge of the bed facing her. Turning her head away, she looked out the window and across the giant front yard as it sloped down the mountain. Toby cleared his throat, but she continued her silence. Well, just maybe he would get the idea that she didn't have anything to say. "Bad day?" Keeping her face averted, she shrugged her shoulders in answer. His voice had been soft and full of concern, and when he asked the question, it sounded like he really cared. It sounded as if he thought of her as a real person, and as if it were important whether she was having a bad day. That should make her feel good, so why did she suddenly feel like crying? Against her will, her eyes welled with tears. And panicked that he might see her cry, she desperately tried to force them back. She certainly couldn't turn and speak with him now. He would be able to tell that she was about to cry, and she would be mortified. So she kept her silence and her face averted. Toby sighed as he sat, searching for the right words. This is impossible, he thought. She's obviously upset, and with girls, you never know what's going to happen when you ask them what's wrong. Why had he promised his mom he would talk to her? Still, he had promised, and he now realized he was stuck. He took a breath and jumped in. "Look, I know my mom can be a little pushy sometimes, but she means well. Don't be mad at her." He was met with another solid wall of silence. He watched her profile. He could see why everyone was making such a big deal about her new stuff, because she really did look pretty. "That's it. Dad says to say something nice to a girl about how she looks, and it'll have her eating out of his hand. Your new sweater is really pretty." Her head swung around as if he'd thrown a bucket of ice water on her, and she wasn't smiling. As a matter of fact, if looks could kill, he's sure he'd be deader than that snake he'd killed out in the pasture last summer. He rolled his eyes. Obviously, this wasn't working. Well, there was certainly no reason for her to be mad at him. He hadn't done anything to the girl. He'd gone out of his way to be kind. He'd covered for her when the glass broke. He had apologized for Ben. Why was she giving him the silent treatment? It was his mom she was mad at, and heck, his mom wasn't really that bad. "Look, Caro, haven't you ever tried to fix anything?" She raised her head, her eyes questioning. Encouraged that at least he had her attention, he forged on. "You know what I mean? Like picking something up off the floor, or straightening a picture on the wall, or restacking the magazines on the table so they're just right." She remained silent, but her eyes were attentive. "See, that's all Mom was doing. Straightening up, restacking, fixing. Mom was just fixing things." Her chin quivered. That wasn't quite the reaction he'd been hoping for. He began to feel a real panic coming on. Oh, Lord, don't cry. He could kick himself. Man, this wasn't coming out right at all. Okay, he thought, just calm down. Try again. "Caro, Mom didn't mean any harm. You see, she sees things that she thinks need doing, and she just does them. Not that I'm saying you need doing. I mean fixing." A sniffle. Oh, God, she's crying. Man, can you be any more stupid? He sat momentarily stunned, listening to her muffled sobs. Decisively, he stood. Maybe I should go now." When she didn't answer with anything other than another loud snuffle, he turned toward the door. He was halfway out when his conscience yelled at him, "Coward!" Someone may have just as well knocked him in the back of the head. And coming to an uncertain halt, he turned slowly and peered back at her. Sighing, he stepped back inside and closed the door. I can't leave you like this." He shoved his hands in his pockets. "What in the world can I say to make you feel better?" Feeling completely inadequate, he went to her and placed his hand on her shoulder, and she flinched slightly, and he realized it wasn't him that was good at scaring her. It was her that was easily scared. He patted her shoulder softly as he eased down next to her. Carol, you're not the only one she's ever tried to fix. Honest. At least you don't have to live with her. She tries to do something to fix me every day. Stand up straight. Learn to speak properly. Manners are important. You are not going out dressed like that. The last was said in a mock female voice, and he rolled his eyes. It never ends. This got her attention, and Carol raised her head to look at him, wiping a tear away. When she smiled timorously, he blew out a breath of relief. The crisis was over. He jumped up and grabbed the box of tissues off the dresser and placed them in her lap. She took one, wiped her tears, and blew her nose. It made such a funny trumpet sound that they both laughed. She sniffed. She tries to fix you? Sure, but it's not like I listen to her or anything. Well, I mean, sometimes I humor her. After all, she is my mom. Carol smiled. She's pretty nice and all. I guess I just felt sort of weird, like everyone was making fun of me. No, it wasn't like that. It was just that, well, you really do look pretty. And when she frowned, he added quickly, but if it makes you feel better, I'll tell you you're as ugly as a dead possum in July. She giggled. He figured he was in calmer waters, so he quickly changed the subject. So how did you meet the Stillwaters? She drew an unsteady breath before she answered. They live in the same apartment building. They needed someone to babysit while Mrs. Stillwater is working at night. They're saving up for a down payment on a house. Well, knowing Uncle Jim, I bet you make good money. Pretty good, I think. She blotted her eyes with another tissue. At least you get paid. I do all the stuff around here for free. When she was silent, he searched for another subject. The kids seem to like you a lot. She smiled. I love them. They're just the cutest little kids in the world, and the Stillwaters are great. They don't judge anybody. They trust me with their kids. That means a lot. As he watched her talk, he realized she was different from most girls. Any other girl might say something about how messy little kids are or what a hassle they are, and they sure wouldn't talk about the importance of the trusts some kids' parents might place in you. He's not even sure he would have thought of that. You're pretty smart for a 12-year-old. She made a face. You're pretty smart for a boy. He grinned at her. Her hair was shining in the late afternoon sun, slanting through the window. It honestly was pretty now, just like everyone said, and the earrings glinted as she moved her head, and thinking to get a better look at the newly drilled holes in her ears, he reached up to tuck her hair behind her ear, and she flinched. He lowered his hand. Why do you keep doing that? Doing what? You duck like you think I'm going to hit you or something. I don't hit girls. Her smile disappeared. I don't do that. Yeah, you do. She looked at him with fire in her eyes. Well, why don't you just mind your own business? Toby wanted to get mad right back, but he realized something in that instant. Pressing his lips together, he made a decision. It doesn't matter if you don't want to admit it anyway, because I know why you do it. Caroline swallowed hard, feeling like a trapped animal. She waited uneasily for him to go on, but his next words took her by surprise. Let's be friends, Caro. Real friends. Friends that are special and tell each other things they wouldn't tell anyone else. Her eyes blinked slowly. He held his hand out to her, but she didn't take it. He waited. He'd done the same thing with a kid at school. Good old Jeff. Toby and his father had talked at length about Jeff. Back in elementary school, everyone picked on Jeff, and Toby would never understand why they did. Jeff was a great guy, maybe a little heavy, but a great guy. And it upset Toby terribly to see Jeff so abused. And one day, when things got too bad for Toby to stand idly by, he decided to do something about it, and he stepped in to take up for Jeff against the typical playground bully. And Toby ended up with a 3-day suspension from school for fighting. Hence the talk with his dad. His father told him first, he was proud of his son for stepping in and doing the right thing. And second, Toby couldn't change how other people saw Jeff, but Toby could offer his own friendship. Toby had done just that, and he and Jeff had been best friends ever since. That had been a few years ago. Now, Jeff had grown tall and slimmed down, and Barring a really crummy tryout, he and Toby were slated to be the only freshman starters on the high school baseball team. And Jeff, well, Jeff was now Mr. Popularity himself. Toby eyed the small girl in front of him. Come on, Caro, he prodded. Wouldn't it be nice to have one person, just one you could trust? Someone you could talk to and tell anything, and you know they would never tell anyone? She looked up at him, hesitant and shy. A friend? Someone she could talk to? It would be nice. None of the kids at school ever talked to her. To be fair, she didn't talk much to them either. Finally, she smiled and timidly placed her hand in his to shake on it, but he didn't let it go. Instead, he held it as he spoke. Friends? Friends, she affirmed, then immediately cornered him. So, tell me a secret, something you don't want anyone else to know. It was a test of the new friendship, and he knew it. He thought hard, heaving a sigh. He continued to hold her hand, turning it over in his, this way and that, examining it as he spoke. You promise not to tell anyone? She nodded solemnly. Back when I was 8, me and a friend were out in his father's hayfield playing with a magnifying glass. We would set fire to a small patch of grass and then stomp it out. And after we did it several times, we decided to let the next one burn a little longer, let it get bigger. We thought we could put it out easy enough. Well, we couldn't. And it spread so fast. Suddenly, fire was all around us. And when we realized we were in over our heads, we ran. The entire field burned. And to this day, his dad doesn't know how the fire got started. Her eyes were wide. Oh, my. I bet y'all were scared. He laughed. Well, mostly scared of getting caught. He tugged on her hand. Now, you tell me something. She shrugged. I can't think of anything to tell. Sure you can. It doesn't have to be your biggest secret, just something. He waited while she thought. There's nothing to tell, she insisted. So, she's not going to play fair, he thought. He should have known. Well, he'd given it his best shot. He'd gone above and beyond what his mom had asked. He stood abruptly. Okay, fine. I gotta go. He started to leave and got as far as the door when she finally spoke. Why? He stopped and turned. Why, what? You said you know why I do that thing. So, tell me why. You mean why you duck like I'm going to hit you? When she nodded, he leaned against the door, arms folded across his chest, choosing his words carefully. I'm always bringing home stray animals, all kinds. It drives Mom crazy. One day, I brought home this old flea-bitten dog. It had large areas of fur missing from his back and sides, and the vet said it was scarring. Scarring? Yeah, from being beat so much. We had to be real careful about how we tried to pet him because whenever we reached out toward him, he would cower. He was so used to being hit that he automatically thought it was about to happen again. My dad said that this is called conditioning. He stopped to see if she understood, but she only looked at him with those big brown eyes, waiting for him to finish. Well, Caro, I think you've been conditioned. And that is the end of chapter 1.